Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all you do to make the Interfaith Council work. It's a lot. It is very difficult at times, but we are working and looking for people to join us. So if you're interested in working with the Interfaith Council, please let us know, and we'd love to include you in our work. I'm going to invite Isaac Wright and Dr. Juim Navarro Rivera to come up to the stage, please, and sit while I introduce you to these fine gentlemen who have come to enlighten us today. Dr. Juim Navarro Rivera is a leading expert in demographics and politics of non-religious Americans. He is the managing partner at a socio-analytical research firm which designs projects for progressive nonprofits. He is the author of the Secular Politics newsletter, where he explores the intersection of secularism and politics. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut, and he edits his newsletter, Secular Politics, which provides valuable insights and analysis. He has been an integral member of several renowned research teams, including the 2008 American Religious Identification Survey. His expertise has received attention from national as well as international media, and he is frequently quoted by multiple national and international news outlets such as the Washington Post and also PBS. So please welcome Dr. Juim Navarro Rivera. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. Just for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second speaker, then we're going to turn it over to you, and then we're going to go right into our second speaker, okay? Because I know if you are a delegate, you are already getting those wonderful texts on your phone saying, get to the United Center as fast as you can, go get on a bus. And so we want to make sure that we get you out on time, and so we're going to do everything we can to conserve our agenda. Isaac Wright, and I want to take a moment of personal privilege. I've known Isaac for a long time. He actually came to Arkansas and got our Democratic governor elected not once, but twice. And so we had a Democratic governor, Mike Beebe, and he served for 2 wonderful terms and helped us do great things in Arkansas. So Isaac, let me say publicly thank you for that. We need you to move back to Arkansas, and so we can beat Sarah Huckabee Sanders in the next election. Isaac Wright has over 20 years of experience as a communication operative and strategist for campaigns and in public affairs. You have probably seen Isaac or heard him on Scripps TV. He's sometimes on Fox News, CNN, POTUS Radio, USA Today, and other outlets. He is a face that you will probably recognize. He is the co-founder of the Rural Voter Initiative and the founding partner of the Forward Solution Strategy Group. He was named as one of the American Association of Political Consultants 40 Under 40 in 2015, and as a 2011 Rising Star of American Politics by Campaigns and Elections magazine. Isaac served as executive director of the Principal Research and Rapid Response for the presidential 2016 Super PAC effort. He was the primary state communications director for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2007 and 2008. He is a proud graduate of the University of Tennessee, where he has served and continuing to serve for a short time on the Board of Visitors. So please welcome these 2 distinguished gentlemen to the Interfaith Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I want to thank, before I start, I want to thank co-chairs Ahmed, Mas, Bays, and especially co-chairs Levin and Roebuck for this invitation. As you heard before, I'm Dr. Juim Navarro Rivera, the managing partner and research director at Socio-Analytical Research. I'm also a political scientist. I work mostly with my work in Socio-Analytica, mostly with Black-led and women-led organizations to do grassroots research projects, including surveys, focus groups, and other types of analysis. I have 20 years as a social scientist, with my particular expertise as a political scientist in race and religion. And for over 15 years, I've been an active member of the humanist communities, and so it's part of my, my life and my hobby, essentially, like work on secularism and humanism, and trying to build bridges across communities. In this presentation, I want to focus on 3 points that I consider that to be part of the future of not just American politics, but especially the future of the Democratic Party. And it's the reality of a less religious America, its impact on politics and specifically the party, and I want to focus in this case on a few key religious cohorts within the party coalition, and finally the opportunity that this presents to build a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy starting within the Democratic Party. I'm going to be showing data from many sources. One of the downsides of the growth of the secular population is that there has no been a strong scholarly interest. So there's a lot of different sources, some of it that I have done, some of it that has been done by other organizations. But it's basically trying to piece together a story from what it has been available in recent years. I'm going to start with there we go. Religious change, and it starts with these dramatic changes in religious affiliation that we have had in recent years, but this trend goes back at least 3 decades, and it involves a lot of demographic groups. So I'm going to dispel some stereotypes in there, and I'm going to talk about these changes. Sociologists like to talk about the 3 B's of religiosity, which is belonging, so your religious identity, your beliefs, and your behaviors. So the growth of secularism in the United States not just involves the B of belonging, it also, at the larger scale, just in American religion in general, involves the B's of belonging, behavior, and beliefs. And I want to start with this chart actually has 2 data points from the Public Religion Research Institute. Actually, the one in 2013, I actually was working there in those days. And it shows that in the last 10 years, at least, the nation has become less Christian. If you look at the Protestant Christian bars on top, we have a 5 percentage point decline, and we have a 7 percentage point increase in the secular population. And when I talk about secular in this case, I want to define the terms because we've heard many ways in which this population has been talked about. It's what it's called the knowns, N-O-E-N, N-O-N-E-S, sorry. And it's, it comes from all sociological surveys in which they ask open-ended questions about religious identification, and people used to say known. Right now, the way that most surveys have been standardized ask a question about religion, and they have the options atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. That cohort is what we're calling secular in here. So it's people who self-identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. And even within there's also some shifts going on. Of course, the Catholic population, the 2013 and the Catholic population in 2023 are very different. It has become more Latino, more Asian over the years as the population from Latino and Asian origins has increased in the general population. A lot of Catholics actually are coming from those origins. So the Catholic population nationally is stable in terms of the percentages, but internally has shifted dramatically in terms of its racial and ethnic composition. I want to zoom back a little bit to show that this growth of the secular population has been more dramatic in the last decade, but actually started at least 30 years ago. Between 1972 and 1982, it only grew 2 percentage points. This is from the General Social Survey that actually has comparable data over time. And then over the next decade, it only increased 2 points. And then by the end of the 1990s, we see in 2002 increases from 9 to 14%, an additional 5 percentage point increase by 2012, and right now, at least the last General Social Survey is about 27%. One of the things is that depending on the survey, depending on the methodology, and depending on the questions, right now the secular population ranges from the high 20s to the mid 30s. So it depends on your survey, but essentially all have kind of like the same trend going upwards. And so what happened in the 90s? I mean, I think many things happened in the 90s, but part of it, and sociologists have various theories, is the fact that you have the end of the Cold War, and the Cold War was steeped in religious language to kind of like differentiate Americans from the Soviets. You also have the rise of the internet, where a lot of people who were not particularly religious are finding communities that are not near them, but essentially virtual. So they're part of that, and then the rise of social media, of course, make that actual part easier. But the other thing that is happening is that for the longest part, I think that first cohort of growth was essentially people abandoning a religious identity. Right now, what we're seeing is cradle secularism. So it's people who are being raised by people who were not religious in the first place. So this is, I think, a new phenomenon which we need to talk about more because it involves younger voters, involves younger people, and how and I think Isaac, it's probably gonna deal more with the aspect of language, but a lot of people who are not even used to that kind of faith language, like I grew up in Christian school, so I'm used to hear about faith, but my children probably not, because we don't do that, and a lot of younger Americans are essentially like disassociated with the language of faith. There's a lot of diversity. If you look at the early studies of secularism, you would see that, especially if we go back to the 1990s, most of them were men, were highly educated. So it was kind of like your academic cohorts. It was people like me if I were white, like middle-aged white college professors, so to speak. There was a big gender disparity between men and women. Right now, the secular population, with the exception of age, looks like the general population. There's a gender disparity that wasn't there even 15 years ago, where 60% of males, secular people were males, and 40% were women. A third of secular people are people of color. Is a big rise, especially of Latinos and Asian Americans. It's not the domain of the highly educated. They're as likely to be college graduates as the general population. And the other of the main differences is that they're twice as likely to identify as part of the LGBT community. And surveys have also shown that essentially the majority of LGBT people have secular identities, religious identities. Another misconception I want to talk about now is the beliefs of the secular population, because we hear a lot about the spiritual but not religious. This contingent that usually if you listen in the radio or watch a segment on the rise of the secular population, or you read an article, would say like, oh, the secular population is growing, a lot of more Americans have no religious identity, but they're still spiritual, they still believe in something, they always have that caveat. And I I'm using two data points. One is from 2020's original survey that we did with Socioanalytica Research, the Secular Voices Survey, trying to dig deeper into the beliefs and behaviors of secular Americans, and others from a recent survey from PRI. The yellow bars are the recreation of a question that we asked back in 2008 when I was at the working at the American Religious Identification Survey, asking people their beliefs about God. This is only the secular population. And what it says, if you look, most of the secular population is kind of like, or the plurality, they're kind of like agnostics. They say there's no way to know about God. Then you have a quarter who say that they believe in a higher power. But the interesting part is we don't know what that higher power means. And me being involved in different secular communities, I hear people talking about, nature, and kind of like feel a sense of connection with the universe, but not necessarily thinking of an Abrahamic God, so to speak. Then we have a 17%, almost 1 in 5 who are atheists, who say that they don't believe in God. The interesting part is that the percentage of people who say that they're atheist by belief is much higher than the percentage of people who say they're atheists by identity. So that's another misconception. If you take at face value what a survey says of people who say that they're atheist, it doesn't tell you exactly how many atheists are in the country, because a lot of people would not say they're an atheist. I would use myself as an example. If I answer one of these surveys, I would say I have no religion because I don't consider atheism a religion. But if you ask me about my beliefs, I would say I don't believe in God. And 70%, so a similar percentage, say that there's a God, kind of like Abrahamic, with which you can communicate with, answers to prayers, and maybe has affects human affairs. The purple bar I want to show, it's a recent survey from PRI among people who left a religion. So this is not just only all secular people. But essentially people who left a religion. And I wanted to stress the point is a lot of people who left religion didn't leave religion mostly because they got tired and they didn't want to go to church, or the drive was too far. Essentially they stopped believing in the religious teachings. And so this tells you that there's something more going on than just people being too busy to go to church. It means that there's something else sociologically happening. But it's not just the secular population that is shifting religion. We are seeing also, even among people who identify as religion, a declining in church attendance. In fact, the last numbers, I think, from Gallup that came out last year kind of like led to a lot of coverage about the declining percentages of church attendance. And what we're seeing is that I'm here looking at key political constituencies for Democrats and Republicans. The most likely to report church attendance is white evangelical Protestants, black Protestants who are at different ends of the political spectrum. Republicans are almost twice as likely as Democrats to report going to church weekly. And of course, we're using church because these are essentially mostly Christian cohorts. White Catholics and Latino Catholics are also very unlikely to go to church on Sundays. And of course, the secular population, which 9 out of 10 essentially say that they never attend any kind of services. The other thing that is changing is the share of people who say that religion is very important in their lives. And in that sense, we see again the main two cohorts in which respondents say that religion is very important to them are white evangelical Protestant, black Protestants. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to say that religion is a very important part of their lives. Latino and white Catholics are similarly situated in there, and only 1% of the secular population say that religion is an important aspect of their lives. So what we're seeing is not just a change in terms of identity, looking at the larger secular population, but also a change in religious behaviors and beliefs within the general population, people who still identify as, as religions. And that's also leading to some sort of political change. What we're seeing is that the decline of one of the main assumptions of American political culture since at least the days of Alexis de Tocqueville, that America is a deeply religious nation. In some ways it still is, but in many ways it still isn't. People are not just leaving their religious affiliations, they're changing beliefs and even trust. Like Gallup, every once in a while, asks this question about institutions that people trust, and organized religion keeps dropping in the rankings. And when it comes to politics, it is Democrats in particular who are at the head of this change, right? Like the Republican coalition has become more Christian nationalist. The Democratic coalition has become more ecumenical and religiously diverse. And sometimes, if we're going to see, religions may supersede race in some instances. And so, in this case, we're going to see the share of the Democratic vote by various religious cohorts. And what we're seeing is that since at least 2000, this is data collected by the Pew Research Center, for the last 2 decades, the secular population, which is that bold blue line, has been essentially, along with other non-Christian religious and Jewish voters, the most likely to vote for Democrats. This is broad religious coalition, so I'm not dividing here by race. If you divide Protestant by race, then you will see, and Catholics by race, you will see those differences. But essentially, broad religious coalitions or religious cohorts, it's been secular voters who have been consistently over 60% voting for Democrats. The main difference is that this cohort is the only one that is actually growing. So it's not just that they are one of the biggest cohorts in the coalition, it's also that constantly every election become a larger part of the coalition. We look at the Congressional Cooperative Study and the 2020 vote by religious identity. This is sorted by the higher share of Biden vote, and we see that secular Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, and then other religions are the groups that actually gave a majority voted for the Democratic Party candidate. So in essence, with the help of Black Protestants and Black Christians and Latino Catholics and other people of faith, like Buddhists, Unitarians, and others, like essentially the Democratic coalition has become a truly ecumenical faith in which like every faith is represented and every faith is actually strongly supporting the party. And the large, broad Christian groups like Protestant Christians, born-again Christians, and Mormons, both mostly Democratic, but of course these groups are also divided by race, including the Catholics, the Catholic cohort. If we look a little deeper into the coalitions in the 2020 presidential election, what we see is that even though secular Americans and people from other non-Christian faiths maybe account from 1/3 to 40% of the population, they actually are nearly half of the Democratic coalition. And those Protestants and Catholics who are part of the coalition are increasingly African American, Latino, Asian, and racially diverse. While the Trump coalition, it's very, very Christian and particularly white. And now this one, it's the Biden share of main religious cohort. So we're looking at Protestant, Catholics, and seculars by race. And the interesting part in here is that what we're seeing is that Black people, Black Americans, African Americans, regardless of religion, are a strong Democratic cohort. Like Black Protestant, Black Catholics, and Black secular Americans vote at over 8 out of 10 and given the size of the Catholic, Black Catholic cohort, there's a wider margin of error. So you could technically say that they vote at the same rates. The other aspect is that secular voters, regardless of race, are Democrats. So white secular voters are the only white religious cohort that votes for Democrats. And so the important part in here is that a messaging that includes all these diverse groups of religious people and non-religious people can actually help build a stronger Democratic Party that can actually bring up the the true promise of American democracy, where people of different faiths, different races can actually work together. So I want to close with this section of opportunity because I think we shouldn't despair the fact that this diversity is happening. I think there's a lot of opportunity in these changes of the religious demography because even though they have different views of faith and the supernatural and God, they do care about the same issues. And I'm going to focus on three, which are climate change, immigration, and abortion. But I mean, we could go on with more examples, especially economic issues. And so in the case of climate change, this is a PRI survey from last year in which they asked people if the percentage of people who say climate change is caused by human activity. And I only included the cohorts that a majority of people agreed with that statement. The most likely, and this is not just on this survey, but historically, at least the last 10 years, secular American and Latino Catholics are the most likely to believe, or to say that climate change is caused by human activity. Secular Americans, very grounded in science and scientific consensus. Latino Catholics have been always interested. I've been writing about that for the last decade or so. And it seems that the transnational connections of Latino Catholics, I'm not a Latino Catholic, but I do have transnational connection. My wife is from Mexico. I grew up in Puerto Rico. In Mexico, for example, there's been like a strong media presence of educating people about climate change. In Puerto Rico, we kind of like got educated by Hurricane Maria and the increasing numbers of storms and hurricanes. So there's a lot of conversation about the changing climate. And so, back in the day when I was at PRI, the earliest surveys on climate change that we did, for the most part, Americans thought of climate change as an issue, but an issue that happened in other countries. So it's interesting to see people who had connection to other countries thinking that it was a major issue. Now those numbers have shifted a little bit. The other issue is immigration. PRI has been asking about Dreamers for at least 12 years. This is a three-part question in which they ask whether Dreamers should be granted a path to citizenship, granted residency, permanent residence, or be identified and deported. Most people, for the most part, don't select identify as and deport, except for white evangelical Protestants and Republicans. But only three groups actually have a majority who said that they're in favor of citizenship. Most people are in favor for residency. And in this case was secular Americans of any race, Latino Catholics, and Black Christians, Protestant, Catholic, or of any denomination. So, this is another area of agreement in which these groups that have theological differences actually come together. And finally, one that has become an even bigger issue over the last 2 years, which is favoring legal abortion. And again, this is the people who say favor legal abortion in all or most cases, who say a majority are in favor of this position, ranging from secular Americans, Jewish Americans, Black Protestants, white non-evangelical Christians, and Latino Catholics are all a majority in favor of this particular policy. So I want to summarize in here, but the takeaways is that we are in the midst of a religious realignment, not just in terms of the growth of a secular population, but also the changing of what religion means. And I think sociologists are chewing on this question of how are we defining religion and how people are living the religion. It's very different from what my parents and my grandparents were living. We have religious belief, belonging, and behavior that are rapidly changing in ways that it's too fast for us to actually keep track of. We're increasing numbers of non-religious people of all races, age, gender, identities. So it's not just limited to certain demographic groups. It's a national phenomenon. And the behaviors of religious people are also changing, and we need to tune into how people are living their faith these days. And we need to pay attention in the Democratic Party because these affect the Democratic Party way more than they affect the Republican Party. Because we have a more diverse coalition. We have a coalition that includes large numbers of non-Christian faith, the secular, and of course, large cohorts of Christians. And even though we have a big religious diversity within the party, these cohorts are well aligned on many issues. And so communicating with them, as my friend is going to inform us soon, it's going to be very important. I want to thank you for this opportunity. If you want to look at our work, you can, in the transition, hit that QR code, and I'll look forward to hear your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. That was fascinating. I don't claim that my charts and statistics are going to be nearly as good. But I'll tell you what, if you'll hang in there with me to the end, I will show a video.
3 fingers to the left, I think was.
It's not picking up with 3.
Maybe not.
Let's just go here. We'll do it this way.
That
there we go.
works better.
I promise, if you'll make it with me to the end, I'm pretty boring. But if we can make it to the end, we'll have a couple of videos of examples of how to use what we're going to talk about, right? Dr. Rivera just shared with us these ever-changing dynamics, how it influences the way people view public policy issues, how they view politics. And I'm going to tell you right now, the research that we've done at the Rural Voter Institute that I'm going to talk about today in this perspective was not something we set out to find. Does anybody recognize that map? Oh, isn't it ugly? Yeah, that's the 2016 election results. Notice anything? Yeah, the geography, right? So we founded the Rural Voter Institute coming out of that election of how to better communicate with rural voters in the country, small town voters, etc. Now, how did that lead us to this conversation, right? Study and study have shown that rurality and religiosity correlate in this country. It's just part of the fabric of our society, of American society. And coming out of the 2016 elections, look at that number, nearly 6 in 10 people in rural areas say Christian values are under attack, right? And in our own custom research at RVI, when we talked to voters in rural and small town communities, they talked about how their faith traditions influenced the way they viewed the world around them, how they related to it, politics, who they voted for, issues, etc. So looking at that correlation of rurality and religiosity and seeing what we just talked about in the data and the rise of the nones, right? The rise of the unaffiliated. And we're going to look at a second, too, in a breakdown of different faith traditions in America and voting habits at the present and what they look like. How do we meet at the intersection in a way that we can effectively communicate with voters from all backgrounds, secular, various faith traditions, in a way that is persuasive and motivates people? Well, let's look again, just quickly at the facts. If we don't, we run the risk of an us versus them mentality, right? If we are not careful, we will run the risk of dividing those same communities that we want to be able to hold office to represent, that we want to be able to talk to during campaigns and work with. That's a quick study of a quick graph of how many people respond to religion causes more problems in society than it solves, right? And you see that graph of distinction. So when we get into this conversation, we have to be inclusive of all faith traditions, of the nuns, the rising populations of nuns, the unaffiliated population we'll look at in a minute, and be inclusive to bring people together. And we found that moral language is the way to do that. Again, it can be a polarizing issue, right? Sociologists have looked at the patterns in the rise of the nuns and looking back at origin of timeline of when people in America are forming critical views. And as you see spikes in the religious right activities, you see resulting down the road people coming of age and increases in the nuns in the population wave. So, I promised earlier we'd look real quick. Some prominent religions across the country, where their partisan voting patterns are, right? We just saw in detail a minute ago the pattern of the nuns and major religions. This includes unclassified, nothing in particular, or the unaffiliated and spiritual, as you mentioned, etc. So what does that mean for us? How do we effectively engage? Well, I promise, we would talk about an answer. This was not something we set out to find with RVI, but as we talked to voters and their influence in what they talked about in that, and the correlation of religiosity with morality, we began to explore that dialogue. And what we found was that moral language is every bit as effective as faith-based language with both faith voters and secular voters. In fact, I would say if we're really going to be effective at not just turning out people who already agree with us, but at persuasion, what we found was that idea of moral language is something that connects with all sects, that persuades people, that moves them. Authenticity is key, right? If you only walk away with two things from this dialogue, or from this part of it, I hope that's what you walk away with, right? Moral language matters. We'll talk about what that looks like in a second. And that authenticity is key. Be who you are, especially in these dialogues where we talk about secularism or faith traditions. This is an intimate part of people's lives. This is a decision that they had to come to. Perhaps it was part of the cultural heritage they were born with and raised with. And so having that kind of authenticity about your own beliefs in a dialogue with other people is critical, because as Scientific American has reported in the last couple of years, trust right now in America, especially in institutions, is at an all-time low. Part of that, what we see in the cultural fabric, is that people are hungry for that kind of authenticity. And it's not limited to any particular political party. It's not limited to any education level, studies have shown. Now, we also don't want to overlook faith communities, right? We recognize there are certain religious traditions and sects that are certainly harder for us to engage effectively and communicate. But in our own studies with Midwestern battleground state rural voters, we found that roughly 50% of rural voters who were surveyed who attended church services on a weekly basis either voted for Democratic candidates or were open to voting for them. That breaks down roughly half and half. I'm not going to read the statistics right off the page there. But roughly half and half of that 50%, about a quarter and a quarter of weekly church attenders said, you know, I vote for Democrats on occasion when I think they're the better choice, or I'm open to voting for them if I think they're the right candidate and the better choice. We don't write off any segments as we work towards inclusivity. Now, a quick primer. Is anybody familiar with the Atlantic Explainer series? It's been around for a few years. Great videos, break down complex issues and stuff. This is not the whole thing. You'd much rather hear 8 minutes of it probably than my whole presentation. But it's a quick, edited down version. It's some highlights about the history of the Democratic Party, the change in demographics of secularism in the party, and about the use of language historically in the party.
Many religious voters feel alienated from the Democratic Party. Donald Trump overwhelmingly won Christian voters, including 81% of white evangelicals and 60% of white Catholics. But there's something bigger going on. Democrats often have trouble speaking in moral or religious language.
Democrats don't know how to talk to a lot of these people that go to church, people of value. I mean, the Democratic Party has become a secular party.
So, is the Democratic Party really secular? To a large extent, yes. 28% of Democrats don't identify with any particular religion, compared to just 14% of Republicans. And only 1/3 of Democrats say they go to religious services at least once a week. Just 10% of Democrats weren't religious in 1996. That number has tripled over the last 2 decades, and the trend is only likely to continue as more young people join the party. Pop culture can also be pretty hostile to religion. Some comedians, journalists, and artists actively antagonize people of faith.
It worries me that people are running my country who believe in a talking snake.
You don't have to pass an IQ test to be in the Senate, though.
Can also be uncomfortable with the language of morality and religion. This is a shift from the past. Progressive achievements like the civil rights movement relied heavily on religious rhetoric.
But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Leaders from Martin Luther King to Jimmy Carter framed their ideals in explicitly religious terms, and audiences were receptive to those messages. Some progressive leaders do this today. Reverend William Barber, the head of the North Carolina NAACP, has successfully led a Moral Mondays protest movement against the racist policies of the state legislature.
I'm a preacher and I'm a theologically conservative, liberal, evangelical biblicist.
Now, here, some of you were at the convention a few years ago to remember those remarks. But here's the thing. What we found is people are hungry for values-based arguments. Voters are hungry to understand the why, and that comes down to moral language, which is equally effective with faith-based language. Now, that said, if you are a person of faith, our research shows authenticity is critical, foundational. So be able to speak about your convictions in your terms in an inclusive way and two-way dialogue, right? So in our research, values-based language, what does that mean? We found the values that specifically stuck out for voters, included fairness, the sense of community or community identification. And there's a distinction there, right? Community, that sense of being one another, helping one another. We're in this together, versus community identification, the idea of how they identify with that community. Hard work, tested really strongly with the voters we talked to, and sort of this concept of self-determination, not in the political science sense, but sort of the ability that they as a person wanted to be able to define their own destiny, right? That their community wanted to be able to define its destiny. Now, moral language is values-based language, and it is, to put it in its simplest, most basic terms, right versus wrong. You see, I am a firm believer that we as Democrats are cursed with being right. And we just think that if we explain over and over enough times, that logically everybody will just come and agree with us, right? But social science teaches us that's not how the human brain works. That's not how we make decisions. There's an emotive piece to it. That's why right versus wrong matters, right? Our tax policy is correct. Not simply because all the lines add up on a spreadsheet and the equation is a stronger economy for the country and for you individually, but because it is morally wrong that the people who stock our grocery shelves teach our kids in school, that put out fires as local firefighters, pay a higher percent in taxes than corporate billionaires in Silicon Valley. That's wrong. That's morally wrong. Same issue, same point, same policy we as Democrats hold dear, but the difference is putting it in moral terms. And being narrative-based, right? Being able to have that conversation about you and where your values base comes from, where your personal values code is, what it means to you. Because narrative is universal. I'm going to nerd out for just a second with some social science here in a minute about that. But before we do, I want to take a quick moment and diagrams from since. So this is some polling we've done in the Midwest, right? My mother was an English professor, is a retired English professor, and they used to diagram sentences. I promise I am not going to make anybody diagram sentences if you remember that from a classroom. But diagramming some of the message of it, okay? What we found was when we tested environmentalism, green, etc., our numbers plummeted with our target audience from these surveys. When we took the exact same values and policies and talked about them in a values-based language, it became one of our strongest arguments, right? Actually moved target voters 39 points in the direction of a generic Democrat. Same thing that used to be a negative, right? Simply in managing how we talk about it in moral terms. Now, I will say, there is a line in that first sentence, let's diagram it for a second, that is explicitly faith-based, right? Democrats put protecting God's creation. That's a faith-based element, right? That's not authentic for everybody to carry, including our rivers, lakes, and streams, and that everyone has the right to enjoy our natural resources. That goes back to that value we talked about from our studies about fairness, that everyone has the right. This means cracking down on corporations that pollute air and drinking water, right? Cracking down on the corporations that are polluting for the rest of us. Again, back to that fairness argument. And making sure that public lands are accessible so families can pass on the legacies of hunting, fishing, enjoying our natural resources in the outdoors. So family traditions with our natural resources can be passed down. Going back to the values we identified about community and community base, right? Taking the same policy, putting them in moral-based language, right? One of the things we found was interesting about the word stewardship. Anybody familiar with that word? It's the most hands I've ever seen go up in a room on that. It's a good feeling. The term stewardship, right? And we're not going to pull out a dictionary here. But in our focus groups, we found the word comes with a moral overtone. Stewardship implies responsibility. So when we talk about caring for the environment, what if we talk about being stewards of the environment? When we talk about fiscal choices and the priorities we make to make sure every American is fed, every person has access to health care, we talk about stewardship of our resources. The word tested has a moral tone about responsibility. Now, I promised a minute ago I was going to nerd out on narrative. Bear with me. Storytelling and narrative are universal. Sociologists have found throughout societies, globally, right? In this country, a social science survey in the 90s found that little tiny kids, even before they can talk fully, are co-narrating at about 2.5 narrations per hour, co-narrating things with a caregiver. By the same time that middle-class kid is 5 years old, they're averaging about 5 narratives an hour, right? It's how we're programmed, how we're wired. It's how we even encode to remember things, and it's how we relate to the world around us, how we begin to understand ourselves. Now, that's true for everybody. We also find the importance of narrative in so many faith traditions, right? From the Hindu creation stories, right? Midrash in the Jewish tradition, arguing with the sacred stories and texts to find meaning and truth. The parables of Jesus and the Buddha, sacred texts in Islam and Baha'i, all of these different traditions, right? narrative is a universal element. So try talking about your narrative, why you understand what it means to have that tax code fair, why it's important to you when you're out there knocking on doors, when you're doing an interview on the local radio station for soon-to-be President Harris and Vice President Walz. It's how we persuade people. Translating your story and your values and where that values code comes into it. So we have to define our values as Democrats, because if you haven't figured it out, if we don't, Republicans are happy to do it for us. And I don't think they have the best intentions. Somebody remember the war on Christmas from Bill O'Reilly to Donald Trump, right? I gotta be honest, I have never once had a tank roll into my living room for a Christmas tree. Maybe it happened to y'all. But this cultural warfare, right? Creating the mythology of the war on Christmas, right? As a way to manipulate voters. If we don't define our values, they're gonna do it for us. Our policies, when we talk about policies, it's not simply for the sake of the policy, because our policies illustrate our values. Where your treasure is, your heart is. Our policies illustrate our values. Using our policies as a way to communicate what we as a party, what you as an individual knock on a door, hop on a radio station, stand up at a local meeting, and ask people to do the right thing and support Kamala Harris. The policies illustrate those values, and our values should define our policies. When we talk about our principles, have the things ready to back those up. Always lead with the principle first. I believe in my values say, that's why I'm supporting Kamala Harris and her plan too. So I know everybody wants to get across the United Center, and we want to have some time for Q&A. I'm going to play a couple examples here of two approaches, essentially do the same thing. Now there's some years between these interviews, so date it. But a couple of examples, right? How to have that conversation and dialogue in moral terms that has no faith-based element, and then one with a faith-based element, right? Both can have the same effect with voters if you're authentic. Hold on. So this was the first one was about a week ago, so bear with me if you're like, oh, but there has been policy rolled out since then, because this is about 6 or 7 days old.
What specific steps do you think Kamala Harris needs to do to make that happen?
A really important step, don't get trapped into the cerebral side of the debate about policy, right? This campaign's only been in existence for 3 weeks. You know, we just announced the vice president in the news this past week we saw. And so I think we're about to hit a stretch where policy is going to be a central focus of the Harris campaign. And as we watch that as voters and look at it come out, I hope that we see the vice president not getting caught into the cerebral aspect of the policy, but talking about the real impact of it, right? It's not just that her tax proposals make sense on paper and the math works, but it's the fact that it is morally wrong that the people on the front line of our country who stock our grocery shelves, who power America, pay a higher tax rate than do corporate Silicon Valley billionaires. Donald Trump wants to see more of that. He's proposed tax cuts for the wealthiest that come in at over $400,000 a year, paid for by tariffs that will be an expense for middle-class families. That's morally wrong. And we have to be sensitive to talk about that, to call that out, not just about how the math works on paper. And I think Vice President Harris has an excellent record of being able to bring those points home, to be able to make it real for people to feel not just the policy discussion, but what is the agenda and the outcome for our country.
Absolutely. It's all about that appeal to the voters who are going to be heading to the ballot box, how they feel at home, the issues most important to them. Isaac Wright, thank you so much.
All right, one last
Good to be with you.
Then we'll open for some Q&A. So this is a different approach, right? The same concept. Values-based and moral language, but in explicitly faith-based terms as to that being the motivator of the why you believe those values. Oh, and it's a little bit older. This is from Donald Trump's first year in office. Do you remember the Trump team released an ad, a TV ad, about the war on Christmas? Does anyone remember that? Yeah. No cultural smoke signals there, right? Whoa.
Trump for letting us say Merry Christmas again.
Oh, okay. So is President Trump winning the so-called war on Christmas? To answer that, we've brought back our panel fully revved up and ready to go. Vince Colonnese, editorial director for the Daily Caller, and Isaac Wright.
And when they hear Donald Trump say Merry Christmas, it really is not about necessarily just a war on Christmas. It's about the war on Christianity.
Isaac, why do you think people are so worried about offending someone?
So this is something Vince and I can actually agree on. I think there is a war right now on Christian values. I actually don't think it's about our holiday greeting and our Christmas greeting. I think that's kind of a distraction. And I think the right wing has sort of created this ruse of a quote-unquote war on Christmas about department store greetings as a way to distract from what Jesus taught and how we actually act on that or not in this country. In the 25th chapter of Matthew, Jesus, whose birthday we're talking about, said, the sheep and the goats will be separated. We as believers will be separated based on how we followed his teachings about how we treat the poor, how we treat the sick, and how we treat the foreigner amongst us. Those were the things that Jesus cited as to what believers will be judged on. And if you look at the policies that have been pushed in the last year in this country, they're the most anti-Jesus teaching policies that we've seen.
Wait, so we're going from a debate over how...
Saying that we need government.
Some of us about why we believe these things. Some of us believe our country should reflect the values of what Jesus taught about how we treat the sick, how we treat the poor, how we treat the foreigner.
And again, this goes back to people being concerned about this idea, this notion of a war on Christmas. Really, this is a proxy for the greater war about Christianity. And
I'm scared, but I'm going to give you the final word here.
This is not a proxy. This is a distraction from the war on Christian values. The first chapter of Matthew talks about Jesus' birth. The second chapter talks about Jesus and Mary and Joseph fleeing Herod as refugees, crossing the border illegally as undocumented immigrants into Egypt. Under the DACA policy, were that our country, we would have sent Jesus home to Herod and not allowed him in this country. That is a war on Christian values, not the holiday greeting.
Jesus wants us to live out our values, not have the government do it for us.
Not ought to let politicians distract them with holiday greetings when they should be worried about, are we living up to what the New Testament teaches and what Jesus teaches?
So, two very different approaches, right? Explicitly faith-based terms to relate a moral code and a values basis of why you believe the things you do, illustrated by policy. Purely in moral language, in the first example, defining the moral stakes of the public debate in our country right now about what our future will be. We can appeal to faith voters and secular voters according to our research when we talk in moral terms. It's how we're inclusive, to bring people into the debate, to make Kamala Harris the next president of the United States. Thank you. How do we want to handle, do we have time for Q&A still? How do we want to?
We are now taking questions. Unfortunately, we do not have a wireless mic, so just come up or raise your hand, and we'll repeat your question so everyone can hear. Oh, can we pass it? Unfortunately not, yeah. You had the first question.
So, one of my questions is about the charts that you were sharing. I mean, I agree with what you just mentioned. The last presentation is something on which we really work on gun violence. We try to stitch the scripture with the values and how it attaches to the people. And the whole thing was to address the people who are going to the mosque and churches and synagogues to understand that let's not go into the Second Amendment, which let's
So is the question to clarify?
Yeah, on the accuracy of the chart, how do you see, can you give a background and on those charts? Because there seems to be a lot of overlap, and we are trying to say, drawing lines that Democrats is different than evangelical church going, although there can be an overlap between them.
Okay, so to summarize, I guess that's for you, Juhan. The
what the chart was showing was different constituencies that lean one way or another, and so like showing the white evangelical was because it's a mostly Republican constituency, and showing their behavior in terms of church attendance, but there was nothing wider implied in there. It was looking at that particular cohort because it's the most likely to report church attendance, which is a Republican-leaning cohort, and then looking at these other cohorts that are mostly Democratic-leaning, and showing that there's a big difference in what sociologists are calling the God gap, right, or the attendance gap, in which like Republicans are the more likely you are to go to church, the more likely essentially you are to identify as a Republican. But that doesn't mean that people who identify as evangelical cannot be Democrat. That wasn't the assumption of the chart. It's showing different cohorts that are core constituencies of mostly the Democratic Party, and in this case showing a particular cohort that is Republican leaning, and also looking at the overall attendance rates of Democrats and Republicans regardless of religion.
Other questions? Okay. I know you had a question earlier. No? Okay. All right, so go ahead. Just to repeat, so the question is, how would you message on a values-based messaging on abortion?
Is that for me?
I'm assuming.
Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah,
we were talking about that.
A woman has the right to make her own healthcare decisions. That is a God-given right to make your own decisions. Now, if the government wants to intervene in that, is that not the government stepping between you and that fundamental right? Now, I think you already know from this conversation, a lot of what you're going to get back and what the person may respond with. And there are multiple theological conversations that I am old enough I can remember that used to happen about this issue as actual theological conversations that have turned very much into political rhetoric and a lot of dog whistles by the other side. So I think after that, you just have to keep coming back to that point. And then there are great examples. Some of them told the testimonials on Monday night here that I think are worth referencing.
I would also like to say that there's also, even if you are a religious person, I'm looking at the abortion question numbers for Latino Catholics, and even in some surveys, even white Catholics who are like theologically opposed to abortion. There's also this element of church-state separation in which you don't want to impose your beliefs on other people, right? And I think that that's also an element to talk, because for the longest time, a lot of religious groups would base, would have their teachings not force it on the state. And I think with the big difference that is happening, especially with the rise of the religious right over the last 5 decades, is the imposition of theology as policy.
And if I may add one thing from an interfaith perspective, I think it's really powerful when you have a really broad interfaith coalition, including Christians and non-Christians who have the opposite view that's informed by their view. For example, the Jewish faith, more generally, really values the life of the mother. So when the law is saying life begins at conception, that's imposing a religious view that is the opposite of other religious views. And so when you have a coalition of Christians who have a different view of where life begins and those issues, and Jews who their faith tells them something different, and Muslims and atheists all together saying, don't impose your views on us because that violates our religious freedom, I find that to be pretty compelling, at least from an organizing standpoint.
Can I throw
yes,
one more point on that? And I hesitate to bring this up just a little bit because I have seen data predominantly just with white Protestant audiences on it, so I want to put that caveat out there. But one of the conversation points I've seen that was most helpful was to impose that as a religious law imposed through government, says that the government can decide when life begins. That also means the government can decide when life ends, and that's not the role of government. And that is something that triggers on a couple of other value sets as well, and pulls the conversation into an adjacent value set. Happy to talk about that more afterwards. Total caveat of the majority of data I've seen on that is strictly with white Protestants, so take that.
I saw you had a question earlier, and I see you too, and you as well. Did you have a question still in the orange? No? Okay, I guess not. All right, raise your hands again. In the back with, yes. Okay, so the question was, how would you approach messaging on Gaza from a values perspective?
You want me to go first?
I don't do a message stuff.
All right. So from a messaging perspective, I think you already kind of nailed part of it, which is to move it away from the idea that it is a religious war. There are a couple of reasons. There are some faith traditions that then associate that with some end-of-the-world fatalism and things that put it into an entirely different framework in which people are not going to be open to hearing new ideas, persuasive conversations, etc., about how they're going to vote in November. So I would be very, very clear to push it quickly into this is not a religious conflict, right? This is about borders. But I would push it out of that. And then in every major faith tradition represented amongst the electorate in this country, there is a huge value on the concept of life. We talked earlier about nuances of that, about the mother's life and the emphasis there in the Quran, for example, in the sacred Hebrew text. But there's always an emphasis put on the value of life. And that's then where I would move into the conversation of that there are too many lives being lost. Yes.
Thank you. You two back there. Okay, just to repeat so people can hear. So the question is, how do you talk to Democrats who are not necessarily religious and might be even uncomfortable with religious language?
That's where I would fall into that moral language framework. And just a recent example with Vice President Harris. Man, I can't wait to shorten the first word off that phrase. When Vice President, soon to be President Harris, talked about raising the minimum wage. When she and Governor Walz announced I think it's $20,000 credit for first-time home buyers, right? That's the morally right thing to do. Our values that we have held true in this country say that you ought to be able to earn a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. And the fact that a person can't support themselves or their family on what literally we use as the word minimum, the minimum should include a meal on the table, not a hungry belly. It's the definition of the word minimum. That's why we believe in raising the minimum wage. We believe in a credit for every first-time home buyer because that is part of the American dream. Part of the American dream is that if you work hard all your life and you give back to your community and you invest in this country, in this society, in the way you live your life, that you ought to be able to have the promise of the golden years ahead of you. And study after study has shown that comes with home ownership. And too many young people in this nation are working 2 and 3 jobs and can barely keep a roof over their head. That's morally wrong. That's why her policies would change that. And that's the way I would do it, right? Put it back into that moral framework.
I think there's also the need for authenticity. I think, I was having this discussion recently about hearing someone saying that they haven't heard enough about faith in the convention, during the convention, and I am like, whoa. I hear everybody talking, like ending every speech with God bless, right? Like, I'm an atheist, so that's not my thing. I don't complain about people, but I think there's an element of authenticity, and I think for many years, Democrats have been afraid of the religious right and afraid of sounding offensive to, going on the offensive on the war on Christmas, and essentially ticking boxes about religion, like everybody saying like God bless at the end of the day. But I think if we were more authentic, allowing people to express their faith, not as ticking a box that's showing we're also people of faith, but that we are a wide coalition of people of different faiths, of no faith, and we can work together to do things, it will be very different. Having more representation, like if you're addressing an audience that is mostly non-religious, or that it's explicitly non-religious, and you don't have someone who speaks that language, you're starting wrong, because you're just not going to sound authentic talking to that audience. And I think it's very different looking at generation, because I'm 45 years old. I went to Christian schools. I know the language. I may be an atheist, but I understand these concepts. But my child is not growing with that religion. I mean, he's growing with a religion scholar, so that's a little different. But there's a lot of people who are growing now who and that are becoming adults, are becoming voters who grew up without religion. Like their parents didn't go to church, maybe their grandparents were, but they don't understand the language. It's not part of who they are, and you may be losing the audience starting over if you don't sound authentically as someone who understands, someone who doesn't speak the language of faith.
I would add one more thing to that question, which is the advice I give for inclusion of secular folks is to personalize and not universalize statements. So there's a big difference between saying something like, faith compels us to XYZ, because then the people who are non-religious don't feel included. But you insert one word and say, my faith compels me, then, and maybe even going a step further to say, and I know everyone here shares that value or is compelled through their values, then all of a sudden it's personal to you, which that's authentic to you. I have no problem with that, and I'm suddenly included in that. So just being a little bit mindful of not making universalizing statements that assume everybody in the room is religious doesn't mean you have to hide your religious faith and expressing it. You just have to make it personal. And your friend next to you had the next question. Oh, sorry, did you want to add something? Please, please.
That is such an awesome point, and it triggered in some of our focus groups with voters, right? There is a point when voters who themselves may be people of various faiths have reservations about somebody who is so explicit in their faith, because they recognize there are things that not every faith tradition agrees on, and they want it to be related through that moral code, through that values-based. And so when you say, and I think that's the exact way to handle that inclusivity aspect, my faith tradition compels me, and then pivot into that value statement, because in the end, even most of the faith voters that we interviewed, and that's why I say moral language works equally effective, it is the idea of getting through that lens, whether it's a personal values code of faith tradition, what is it that you hold as your moral compass and value that's why I can trust you'll do what you're going to say you're going to do?
Go ahead. So the question is, as a reaction to Republicans framing their values in terms of Christian values for a long time, would it make sense for Democrats to essentially do the same?
Before we go down that road on the messaging, I just have to say one point, because from the way you phrased that question, it reminded me in my personal faith tradition. I had a Sunday school teacher as a kid who said, Social Security, social welfare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, it's just the church's unpaid bills. That's why I don't complain about paying taxes. Now, stepping back from that into how we talk about that, our party is a diverse party. Our country is a diverse country, right? If you remember, there was a chart I put up that showed that sociologists have actually traced, for example, rise in the nuns as a correlation to increases in the religious right. So we want to hold to our values, and that is a separation of church and state, right? I value my personal faith traditions because they're mine, because the government can't take them away. And that includes whether your tradition is a specific faith tradition, whether it is atheism, agnosticism, unaffiliated spiritualism. And I don't think we can risk those core values in sense of those are our values as a party. And mathematically, I don't think we can change that electorally. I think if you look at some of the charts, you can find Republican numbers receding based on some of those decisions. Not to turn that into just mathematical equations, but.
I also think there, you're right that, and Republicans have, like, the Christian right has defined what it means to be Christian in America. And I think to some extent, it is, I mean, it's not my job because I'm not a Christian, but Christians who are not part of that theological tradition, and that theological tradition is more ideological than theological, to push back. And I don't think there's being enough pushback. Right? There's a lot of, most of the Christians in America are not part of that particular ideology. And the fact is that for a lot of people, they have become the definition of Christianity in this country. And so if people don't push back, they will continue to define Christianity in their terms. And as Isaac mentioned, there's these spikes of the rise of the power of the religious right coincides with the rise of the knowns, because a lot of people have been turned off by religion, by that particular type of religion. Now there's another aspect, which is like, there hasn't been an increase in liberal religion, like people joining liberal congregations. So I think there's something more going just in terms of the labeling, but also looking at other people of other faiths. Like evangelical in many ways has become now a political label rather than a theological one. You see the rise of Catholic evangelicals, who are essentially like very conservative Catholics, Mormon evangelicals, and even like some strange like evangelical leaning secular people who essentially are like people who are like conservative on these values, and they're kind of like afraid of women having power and people of color, and so but they don't go to church. And so what you're seeing is that it's a label more than a religion at this point, but it defines what it means to be Christian in this country for many people.
You know much more about this than I do, so will you correct me if I'm getting my data wrong? It was about 4 years ago, mainline Protestants overtook evangelicals in America in the numbers, but it wasn't because, and this is what I've found fascinating in the press, it wasn't because that mainline Protestants were growing, they just weren't shrinking as quickly as evangelicals. Is that, am I saying that study right?
So I've seen various interpretations of what these patterns are happening. I think one of the things that I've seen it's that a lot of shrinkage of evangelicals has come from the fact that a lot of people who are evangelical theologically are afraid of saying they're evangelicals because they're not conservatives, or at least political conservative in the context, which in the way that a lot of the statistics are counted means that if you're not evangelical, you're technically a mainliner.
Gotcha.
And so that may be a lot of what is happening there. So evangelical has become a label which a lot of people are running from when they come from these traditions, but they don't fit into the political realm of what the pastors are doing. And you have also seen after COVID that, and especially evangelicals had a steep decline in church attendance, that I think a lot of people found the opportunity during COVID to not going back without the repercussions of not going back.
We have room for one more question, and then my co-chair Nadia is going to close us out. But if you guys are around, please, will you have a few minutes afterwards? Yeah. So please, if you don't get your question answered, please feel free to walk up right after. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for these talks. Could you give us your opinion about how we're doing at the United Center in the evenings with the speeches?
Give us your opinion on how we're doing on values-based messaging at the United Center.
I'm pumped up. I mean, I appreciated particularly Governor Walz's comments last night about the middle class and about the priorities and the way his students talked about him in a values-based way, about that value of community, of investing in one generation to the next. I'm using that as an example because it was last night, but I think that's been an element every night. I also, really quickly, I'll just say it, I mentioned this to one of the DNC staffers in the room earlier. The fact they pulled this off with all of the changes in a matter of weeks is incredible, and they deserve a round of applause. And Nadia, Sarah, Cindy, Leader Roebuck, what you're doing here to help ensure our country goes in the right direction in November. Just as an American, thank you.
Thank you. Your opinion?
Yeah, you know, I've been mostly watching on TV because I don't like crowds, so I haven't gone to the United Center. But what I'm watching, you know, with the exception of everybody, you know, like it's what I'm saying is, you know, there's a larger aspect of the party which I think needs to embrace faith and non-faith more authentically. But I like the vibe of the convention. I think we are in dark times, and I like the jolt of energy that the Harris Walz campaign it's bringing, in which it's making it like, you know, we are fighting. We're not, you know, we are counterattacking. We're not just protecting and like in the trenches, like trying to, you know, trying to cross over no man's land or anything like that, which I think it has been the vibe for the last 4 years, in which we're like seeing these shadow overcoming, and now we're just like bringing a flashlight to it. And I think that has been amazing. And also talking about, you know, issues. Like we were just not talking about like, I mean, I think it has been funny how Trump has, how we've been talking about Trump in the, it's been very humiliating, which I think he hates, and it's probably gonna grate on him. But also talking about like how you can change people's lives, because it's not like, oh yeah, we can save democracy and we're gonna have another election in 2028 and whatever. No, we're trying to change people's lives, and I think that's what matters. It's not like, you know, we're having another election in 2028 and we're not gonna have a dictator, but we're actually using power for something.
Thank you. And now I'm gonna turn it over to close us out, Nadia Ahmad, our co-chair.
Thank you so much to Sarah and to our esteemed speakers. I really also wanted to thank, on behalf of the Interfaith Council, specifically to Sarah. You've just done an amazing job with these programs. I remember the program I was in on Tuesday. I was literally in tears. And Johnny as well, thank you so much for your support. And also to Council Member Cindy Bass. These women are remarkable, and I think of them more as colleagues, but also sisters, and struggling, especially thinking about this important work. And so our journey in terms of organizing is deeply personal and is also profoundly communal. My own path began in my youth, marching in Washington, D.C., participating in protests, as well as engaging in direct organizing. These experiences have taught me the power of collective action and the importance of speaking up for what we believe. Today we stand at a very critical moment in history. It's a time for us that calls on us to be authentically ourselves, as well as to stand proudly in our identities and to accept the work that we're doing so that everybody is accepted and valued. This is really the essence of value-based organizing, recognizing the inherent dignity and rights of every individual. I'm reminded of my first job that I ever had when I was 14, about 30 years ago, when I started as a freelance journalist for Tribune Media. And that experience really opened my eyes to the possibility of fighting for something bigger than ourselves. And it also taught me about the power of words and of stories and bringing the hidden truths to light. And so as we have concluded our session today, I really wanted to have you remember that the heart of our work is the recognition of human dignity. Whether we're advocating for social justice, environmental protection, or economic equality, we're ultimately fighting for the right of every person to live with respect and opportunity. And to those who attended our Tuesday session, you'll recall the incredible energy that we had in the room. And so in the spirit of unity and purpose, we really aim to cultivate here today. And so we're really not just organizing around policies or candidates, but we're really organizing around our values, which are the core beliefs that guide us and inspire us to action. So in our interfaith context, we also recognize that while our paths may differ, our destination is often the same, a more just, compassionate, and inclusive society. By coming together with our diverse backgrounds, we amplify our voices and strengthen our impact. And so I really encourage you to share your experiences and your challenges as well as your visions. And it's through this exchange that we'll be able to discover new strategies for effective organizing, as well as find a renewed inspiration for the work ahead. So I wanted to thank all of you for being here today. Your presence and participation is very vital to this movement. And together we're going to be able to explore how we can translate our shared values